The Technology Alliance project sets us on the path to cooperation, and we are staying with the Center for a New American Security and with Martijn Rasser to examine the benefits and challenges associated with the process of decoupling and their implications in the area of cybersecurity of tech devices and infrastructure as well. So, is decoupling possible, or are we just deluding ourselves? The panelists are given the task of rethinking dependencies in technological supply chains, and I believe also in the deployment of 5G infrastructure. And we have with us Sir Julian King, European Commissioner for Security Union 2016-19, Martijn Rasser, Senior Fellow, Technology and National Security Program, Center for a New American Security, CNAS. We already know that gentleman. Ulf Pehrsson, Vice President, Head of Government and Industrial Relations at Ericsson. Richard Spearman, Group Corporate Security Director at Vodafone. And Izabela Albrycht, whom you have already met because she is the host of the whole conference. However, this panel is hosted by Samir Saran, the President of Observer Research Foundation from India.
Good morning and welcome to what promises to be a very interesting discussion with a very eminent set of panelists. The theme given to us this morning is decoupling. Is it a delusion or is it something that's going to materialize? And we will engage the panelists on rethinking dependencies in technology supply chains. I'm not going to introduce the speakers because they've already been introduced. I'm going to straight away jump into this conversation because we have to make up for some lost time this morning. And I'm going to start with Izabela Albrycht, the president of the organizing committee of this conference, perhaps the most important woman at this time. And I'm going to ask you, Izabela, how far does the decoupling agenda go? How real is it? And how seriously are countries beginning to engage with this subject? Izabela.
Thank you, Samir, for your kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Good morning one more time. I'm really happy that we have this panel today, because when we had our Road to CyberSec meeting on the subject of supply chains, very often more questions than answers appeared. The complexities in the digital supply chain and the challenges regarding the decoupling might be called modern technological Gordian knots. And cutting them requires bold moves and decisions, bringing at the same time, of course, unprecedented consequences. And the COVID-19 pandemic is not without an impact. We could witness the economic experiment of what happens when there is a major disruption in the physical world. And supply chain vulnerabilities were clearly visible in the first month of the pandemic and were caused by dependencies within global supply chains. And the COVID-19 crisis was a disruption of globalization, basically. The pandemic underlines the danger of an over-reliance on overseas manufacturing capacities and raw material imports that are critical to the functioning of the modern digital economy. Some experts consider it to be a good starting point in trying to plan decoupling. And once we start to try fixing it, and I will answer your question now, we may continue the coupling of supply chain and trying to cooperate with companies that are closer to us both in geographical, but also in terms of values. But the coupling is not all about security of a supply chain. It is also about the security of digital infrastructure, which includes processing, gathering, transferring, and soon to be generating massive amounts of data. And this another vulnerability, it comes with the fact that all parts of digital infrastructure are dealing with data, the gold of our times, the resource of modern value creation. And as a result, we might want to have an influence over those parts of digital infrastructure to protect data. So the assumption behind decoupling in many countries is now also that once the decoupling will occur in certain processes, we may have a more cyber secure and resilient infrastructure and components and more autonomy and ability to control it, which in fact means that we will increase security and control over data. So when we are discussing the need, reasons, and consequences of decoupling, we need to have a focus on data. It is clearly our reality now. With US sanctions on Chinese 5G tech providers, Chinese mobile application producers, and Chinese semiconductors company, for instance. Some other countries, like, and you know it very well, India, follow suit with similar restrictions on considering them. And the EU is also strengthening its position toward digital autonomy. So my intuition tells me now that due to the fact that technologies become a source of power and they are all data-driven, this restriction based on national security reasons are as an attempt to gain are actually attempt to gain economic advantages and can go as far as data sets are involved.
So
maybe
let me ask you a follow-up question. As a conference organizer, one of the most important conferences in the world, we have in the past seen conferences argue for greater interconnectedness, for one internet, for countries working together to create one system. Are we now at a stage when the splinter net is inevitable? Are we looking at a world which will have multiple technology spheres? And while the EU, India, and some other countries, the US, might be approaching this medium in a particular way, we will see the rise of a different sphere competing with, let's say, the European idea and the ideals of an internet. Do you think it's inevitable?
Well, I really hope that within like-minded countries, and this call was already made, we will be able to work together to set up the same standards, approaches towards data, privacy, cybersecurity. But when we are considering this decoupling option and the data importance, we can see that we can actually end up with a divided world. In which on the one hand, there is a set of, for instance, Chinese suppliers, and on the other, a large block of like-minded Western countries following their own rules regarding supply chains and security and privacy of data. Of course, questions arises, what about the rest of the world? Are countries from Africa, Latin America, or Asia going to buy Western-based technology? Is price going to be a determinant, or rather security and quality of the products and services? So the problem is very complex, and decision makers must find ways and work together to answer those questions. And I'm really happy that CyberSec Global 2020 can be this platform to discuss it. And I think that with this remark, I wish you a fruitful discussion answering as many questions posed by the coupling process and asked by Samir. So Samir, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Izabela, and best of luck for the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much.
I will quickly turn to Martin, who has already been speaking on this subject this morning. And Martin, let me ask you the first question. Clearly, the digital supply chains have been a focus of attention before the pandemic, but they have certainly been more intense during the pandemic itself. Both the EU and the US and other countries have been reflecting on the issues of digital sovereignty, on dependencies. Let me ask you to kick off this morning's conversation with unpacking what are the major challenges on both sides of the Atlantic, the US and the EU, when it comes to reorganizing supply chains and decoupling some of the old dependencies.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Samir. I would say there's two major challenges when we start talking about detangling supply chains and remapping digital supply chains. I'd say one, of course, they're very complex and they're entrenched. Two, and as you saw in the video earlier, I very much see that a multilateral approach to dealing with this issue is necessary. Not even the European Union on its own would be able to remap key supply chains. It's just too vast and too complex. So if you look at semiconductors, for example, right now the United States still has a lot of the leverage on that front where it's globally very dominant. But at the same time, South Korea has a great strength in memory semiconductors. Europe is very strong in discrete semiconductors. So right there, you already see that global component. Obviously, Japan, Taiwan, are critical in the manufacturing portion, and China, of course, it's growing its manufacturing capacity. It's one of the largest consumers of semiconductors. So, in order to start tackling the disentangling and the remapping of such supply chains, that's going to require very comprehensive effort. I would say overall, Europe, North America, and our allies in Asia, we don't have a strategic interest in seeing China indigenize semiconductor manufacturing. There's also the geographic vulnerability of Taiwan that we have to consider. So because of its geographic proximity to China, it's quite vulnerable to sabotage, espionage, the brain drain. China's increasingly trying to draw human talent from Taiwan to help boost China's indigenous capacity. Then, of course, there's not much slack in the global manufacturing capacity either. So any disruption would be very disruptive. So then, of course, we also need to look at the future. So how do you remain competitive in an area like semiconductors? So these are all the types of factors that have to go into thinking about how to remap these types of supply chains.
Martin,
I think there's yeah, sure.
Let me ask you a follow-up question. You have very broadly identified some key actors in the semiconductor space, but that's possibly also the same actors in the larger technology domain. Let me ask you a more direct and pointed question. Are you confident that EU is in the US corner when it comes to responding to the technology challenge posed by China? It's a very direct question. Do you believe the Atlantic Alliance of the 20th century remains valid in the 21st century when it comes to dealing with the challenges the technology domain is posing to all of us?
Yes, I absolutely do. I think in particular, just in the past 4 or 5 months, I've seen a noticeable shift in European attitudes on the China issue. I think there's no question now that a rising China poses particular challenges to the European economy, the American economy, as well as those of our partners in the Asia Pacific. So despite the difficulties in the transatlantic relationship right now, we have to remember that there's much more than that unites us than divides us. And I think the specific dependencies on China, both as a supply chain node as well as an economic powerhouse, it's not in our long-term strategic interest to be at odds with each other in the transatlantic relationship. Again, I see going forward there will be greater multilateral cooperation, particularly in the transatlantic relationship, because of the shared interests we have in ensuring that we remain economically competitive and that we maintain the necessary level of technological sovereignty, that how we use technologies, how we deploy technologies is not influenced and dictated by an authoritarian government. So that, I think, will be the foundation for the future transatlantic relationship. Obviously, there's divergence of opinions on certain issues, but nothing that's insurmountable. And I think ultimately pragmatism will prevail, and that we'll have a constructive way forward on these issues.
Thank you, Martin. Sir Julian King, let me turn to you for a very similar sounding and similar themed question. Do you believe that the EU has one view on responding to the challenges of safe and resilient supply chains? Does the EU as a whole have a similar approach to China, or are we beginning to see discordant and diverse voices moderate the EU position? And the second part, I'm going to dive into, or in the sense, ask you to reflect on your own role as someone who was leading the Security Union and assess whether EU has done enough in protecting its technology interests, whether it is acquisitions, whether it's the FDI screening rules that have been announced. Has EU done enough, or do you think there is some more that is needed to protect Fortress Europe? Sir Julian King.
Well, thank you, and I'm very happy to follow on from the last two speakers, because I think there's a sort of logic in the way this discussion is going. China is at the middle of this discussion, and there are different attitudes to China. It's sometimes suggested that the Europeans are soft on some of these issues around China, and I don't think that's right. The Europeans over the last year or so have identified China very clearly, both as a competitor in some fields and as a rival. I think that there's now a much wider recognition amongst Europeans of the political dimension of initiatives like Belt and Road. There is a greater awareness of China's active role in trying to fix standards, particularly relevant to technology, in a way that suits China. There is also a real lived experience of a more aggressive form of Chinese diplomacy, which goes all the way from wolf warrior ambassadors to sanctions against countries who are seen to be falling out of line. And there's a much keener awareness of the values difference around the treatment of Uyghurs, the events in Hong Kong, and even though it's not new, Tibet. So I don't think the Europeans are soft, and they are taking measures. To answer your second question, they're taking measures both to invest in European technology and data, AI, cloud, computing, to build a degree of strategic autonomy in those fields, and to protect themselves from what they would see as unfair competition, particularly from state-funded enterprises through some of the mechanisms that you've already referred to. But, and this is important, and it's where I have a slight nuance with the last speaker, that work that the Europeans are doing to build resilience, to push back against some of these negative features that I've described, involves a degree of decoupling, but it doesn't necessarily mean embracing confrontation or bifurcation or an absolute clean break. And there is, I think, some nuance with some of the American policies of this administration and possibly of future administrations as well, wherein initiatives like the Clean Networks agenda, they really are forcing people to make choices. And they really are promoting a clean break that pushes China out of networks and areas of technology. Some Europeans remain reluctant about that. They're reluctant about forcing people to make those choices. They're reluctant about some of the consequences, as well spoke about the risk that people would then, in other parts of the world, opt for the Chinese option. That doesn't seem to be ideal. But there's also some reluctance to go full-on protectionist. There isn't a big EU first movement, unlike some of the debates in America. And there are areas where the Europeans want to continue to cooperate closely with China around climate. That said, I do think that the Europeans and the US have a very strong shared interest in finding ways to work together on this agenda, both on the politics and on the technology. I'm glad now that the Europeans and the US are going to talk explicitly about China and their attitudes to China. I'm glad that there are new initiatives on tech cooperation, like the Global Partnership on AI and cooperation at the OECD. I think it's very important that we support those, because there are some things on the tech agenda where the Europeans and the US don't always see eye to eye, whether that's on tax, regulation, or on privacy. And as the last speaker said, we need really to remember that we are like-minded, and what we have got in common in this area is more important than what divides us.
So, Julian King, I'm not going to let you off easy. I'm going to ask you a more pointed political question. How important is the November election to a transatlantic partnership on the technology domain?
Well, actually, I'm not ducking that question. China and relations with China are a key to how that's going to work out. And I'm not anticipating, whatever the outcome of the election in November, that the US administration will radically change its direction on how it works on these issues as regarding China. So that debate between Europe and the US will need to continue to evolve. Now, obviously, some commentators will tell you that a Biden-led administration would be balancing that debate with more active outreach to allies, including European allies, to try and find common areas of joint endeavor. For example, working together to work with China on climate. So it's not necessarily going to be exactly the same, but nor should one think that there is going to be a clean break on these issues, even with a change of administration.
Thank you. Let me turn to the two private sector speakers we have. In some ways, the rest is all chatter. You are what really matter. Let me first turn to Ulf Pehrsson from Ericsson. I have two questions for you. One comes from what Sir Julian King just mentioned, making choices. How important is partnerships with like-minded countries for a private sector, for an enterprise such as yours? Do you see a greater appetite, interest in a larger number of countries that are seeking your technologies for their 5G networks, for their technology enterprises? Or do you still believe that business has a different dynamic that operates, and perhaps the politics has still not fully accommodated realities of the corporate world?
Thank you for that question, and thanks for having me on this important panel. First, just let me say how proud I am to represent Ericsson here. And you referred, Samir, to 5G rollouts, and of course, Ericsson is clearly the technology leader and market leader in 5G rollout around the world. We are now have more than 100 commercial agreements, 5G agreements, and we have 60 live commercial 5G networks on all continents. So it is happening. And I should say that business in the form of Ericsson, we are happy to be welcomed in basically all countries around the world. And I don't think we are in a position where we have or asked to make choices. I think it's important for us to be superior in the delivery of our technologies, but also, which I think is important in these days when you talk about decoupling, to have a true global supply chain. And I think we've seen that the proof of the strength of our global supply chain has been proven during the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic has showed that we are more dependent on connectivity than ever before. And I think it has actually speeded up that process. And I should say that we are proud to have this global supply chain. And I think we have a very good example here from Poland as well, because a year ago we decided to start manufacturing of 4G and 5G product here in Poland. And we are, through our factory here in Poland and our factory in Estonia, able to deliver 5G products that are needed all over Europe. And since we are sort of now at least online in Poland, I just like to show that, latest products from Ericsson, our factory in Czech, made in Poland, 5G products for our customers. And we have a global supply chain, factories in 10 countries around the world, and we can deliver close to our customers, which makes strong business sense as well. So I don't think we are necessarily having to make those choices. We leave that to politicians. And so far, as I said, Ericsson is welcome in all markets, that even those that have included restrictions for national security reasons, we have been welcomed in all these markets.
So, Ulf, let me ask you, for the benefit of those who are joining us this morning, two questions which sometimes come up in many debates around the 5G network. The first, there's a idea that Ericsson networks have Chinese components, and it's very difficult to decouple the supply chain when it comes to the networks themselves. I think that's one conversation that takes place. The second is that the Chinese networks are cheaper, and countries which are in a different development context may find opting for European solutions more costly. Would you like to respond to these two conversations that take place when countries discuss 5G?
Yeah, happy to do that. On the first one, I can safely say that we are not dependent on Chinese components or products. For example, in our radio base stations, 98% of the active components are actually sourced from the United States, and the remainder from Japanese and European companies. Of course, we have manufacturing in China. That is for the primarily for the Chinese market, but this year we have started manufacturing in the US. We have a live factory in Texas, Louisville, which is now set to produce all the requirements in the US 5G market, where we are the market leader. You can always argue about total cost of ownership, etc. I will not comment on our competitors and the market characteristics of China, for example, but we can see that we can be competitive even in China in the home market of our Chinese competitors. And on a level playing field, we definitely know that we are competitive. We have a very competitive cost structure. We know that. So if there are differences in prices, there could be different business models or other reasons behind that.
Thank you. Sir Julian King, I'll come back to you. I'm just flagging a question for you, but I'll first go to Richard. The question for you, Sir Julian King, is that the Europeans and the Americans, do they need to rethink the business models? Is there a case for government subsidies or support so that these networks can compete in distant geographies? And I'll come back to you with that, but let me first turn to Richard. Richard, you're Group Security Director for Vodafone. How does this conversation implicate Vodafone? Your job is to provide telecom services, to provide safe and resilient and robust connectivity. How does it matter which network your service rides on? Why is this debate important for Vodafone in the days ahead?
So thank you very much for the invitation and for your skillful chairmanship of the debate. It's always tricky coming in as the sort of final contributor, because many of the things points I would have made have already been made very skillfully by previous speakers, and I agree with a lot of what's already been said. I think the important point for us is that we are the providers of the service. And so we are very much at the sharp end of the consequences of both these supply chain shifts and of political decision making which relates to it. And I think that whenever there is a significant change in posture by governments or significant changes within the supply chain, which some of the actions of the United States are driving at the moment, it's the people actively running the networks who often bear the brunt, as it were. So while running the risk perhaps of special pleading, I think what I would say is this: COVID really has demonstrated to everybody just how critical the communications sector is to the critical national infrastructure of a country. And it is the running of the economy, it's the running of and connecting of society, and it has helped governments enormously in terms of making people able to work from home, in terms of being able to collect data for health purposes, in terms of providing e-education and entertainment and connectivity for people who are socially distancing or locked down. So we've got a recent example of where the sector has been incredibly dynamic and has done an extraordinary job in changing the way in which it works, the incredible build out that's gone on in order to support the way in which it works. And it's been very, very adaptable. And as I say, some of those changes in society, particularly the working from home one, I suspect particularly in Europe, will be something that is long term, not just short term. So on one level, you could say, well, the sector's doing okay, it's strong, it's really delivering for society. What I would argue is that there are some real risks to rapid decoupling, and there are some real risks to not thinking through the second order consequences of doing so in sufficient detail. So if you accept that where we are, starting from where we are, is the sort of the essence of the difficulty. If you've got a lot of equipment in your networks across the European footprint, which you have, which is now is coming from companies which are now being moved against, and to some extent a political decision is being taken about a change in attitude to sourcing in that way, then you've got to work out exactly how you're going to be able to make changes. If governments want to make changes, and I would agree with previous speakers that it's for governments to determine their appetite for both risk and the way in which they wish to meet their national security obligations. What I would say very strongly is that if governments want to make changes, and some are, there is a real need for giving adequate time to make those changes, and there will be a need for government support to make those changes happen. And a final point here is that the root cause of this is a fundamental shrinkage of the range of options available in the supply chain over the last 10 years. And that means is that any change to the existing supplier arrangements risks really destabilizing the supply chain overall. And it's not a criticism of current alternative suppliers to the Chinese suppliers, but it is a feature that, given governments are rethinking in quite a fundamental way the relationship they want with China, and given some of the implications of that for this particular supply chain, which is heavily China dependent, we need to be really thoughtful as we move forward. And as I say, companies need stability, they need clear guidance, and then they will need time and support, both to make any changes that governments mandate, but also, I would argue, going forward in the effort to try and diversify the supply chain in a more sustainable way.
Richard, let me ask you a slightly uncomfortable question. Besides the big China debate and organization of our technology businesses taking into account and more assertive or more dominant China, besides this debate, we are also seeing, as the pandemic has unfolded, many other countries become far more nationalistic in their communication policies, control over data, control over networks, censorship, information control. How is Vodafone responding to a more nationalistic technology domain? Is it visible, or is it again something which is only academics like us discussing? Or do you see this happening in practice as well?
So I think we are seeing, as Sir Julian said earlier on, we are seeing a reassessment of government views of how much control they want to have of the critical national infrastructure. And clearly it's one of the features of the success of the communications sector that governments take a greater interest in it because it's more important to their society every year. And we need to build networks that are resilient, trustworthy, and which deliver. And we want to adopt the new technologies at speed, and we want to proceed with digitization as one of the means of coming out of a COVID recession. So there's some really, really potent arguments for governments being interested in how we do our business. And I think that's understood. I think the extent to which we can limit fragmentation, it's going to be good for the global economy in the longer term, whether that be around standards for building new kit or whether it be around agreements on data sharing. I think sort of data sovereignty or data nationalism is a feature of the current sort of political debate. There's no denying it. And of course, we do see that. So we do get regulation in some of the operating countries in which we operate, which does say that data from this country needs to be treated and handled in that country. Now, the technology is capable of doing that, but all of these things can add expense and also change the economic model. And I think what you're seeing in the telecom sector is sign of the stress around that. So the return on capital expenditure is falling and low, and the capitalization, the share value on many major telco companies has fallen dramatically in the last 2 years. So I think my argument would be that governments need also to focus on the health of the sector and think about spectrum auctions and the way in which they organize those sorts of things. And we need to balance, if you like, the appetite of the consumer and governments to drive new investment and to roll things out quickly with the other demands, which are about making it more secure, doing it faster, covering more remote areas, and also now perhaps the types of equipment we can use and from which sources. All of these things add cost and complexity to the model, if you like. And I think what you're seeing is a historic downturn, if you like, in the fortunes of telecommunications companies. And I think that's a worrying sign for governments. Just at the moment when everyone's saying we need more of this and we need it now, there's a real challenge over what we invest in and how fast. So changes are possible and changes are happening. The point I would make is there are opportunity costs associated with those, and we need to go right through that. Which is why I think the partnership element of this, both at international partnership discussions about it and international relations, considering these issues at wider than national levels, really important. And also I think it's really important that the telco sector, including equipment manufacturers, are deeply involved in the discussions with government, because this is a very technical area. Change does take time. It's a complex business, and I think the closer that we can be to governments, the better the outcome will be for the countries.
Thank you, Richard. Ulf, do you want to come in on the diversity of supply chain question?
Happy to do that. And first, let me say I agree a lot with what Richard said on the need to ensure that it's a sort of a viable telecom sector, and of course to release new spectrum at not very price is fundamental to the health of the whole industry. Also, I agree on the importance of data, and we see some concerns there when it comes to being able to transfer data across the Atlantic after Privacy Shield was undercut by the European Court. But on diversity of suppliers, Richard said, yes, we need to ensure that there is a diversity of suppliers. And I think just look around the world. I mean, the markets which have been the pioneers for rolling out 5G, namely United States, relying on three call it sort of Western vendors, and also South Korea, and they are doing extremely well here. So I think it is quite a viable, competitive situation when it comes to 5G vendors, even outside of the besides the Chinese vendors, if there are national security concerns, and also when it comes to the speed of changing track when it comes to vendors. We have some really strong examples in Europe where the leading operator in Denmark actually where Ericsson has replaced another vendor in 10 months' time of the 4G and moving into 5G network now. So I think the industry is quite capable of doing that. And also, I must say, since Richard is there, that in recent trackings, the best 5G network in the UK is our network with Vodafone in London.
Excellent. So, Sir Julian King, I'm going to come back to you. I'd asked you, do we need to rethink business models? Do governments need to support private enterprise? That's something that the Western Hemisphere has not been very good at doing in the recent times. It did very well in the 20th century when you ruled the world, but I think you're struggling with the Chinese now. And of course, let me also ask you the second question that came from the interventions of the other speakers. Are we losing out by decoupling? Interconnectedness also allows the transference of values, transference of our way of lives. And when we decide to look at clean tech or sanitized networks and move out of certain jurisdictions, are we losing something there?
So thank you for leaving me with some difficult questions to round off this part of the discussion. I obviously agree with those at the business end who've just set out very clearly why governments need to think about the health of the sector. It's obviously crucial that they do that. You mentioned earlier, did that mean subsidies? Well, I don't know. I can only speak from my experience, first of all, in the UK and then at the European level in the Commission. Reaching for direct subsidies wasn't always the first lever. There are other things you can do to create ability and clarity and support for a productive business environment. And relevant to tech, some of those things are now taking place through reinforced and properly funded investment in key areas of tech, through clearing up where necessary some of the regulation that is very relevant, particularly to the development of a data economy, and through preventing unfair competition. So I do think that there will be more work done on making sure that, for example, competitors who get state subsidy don't get to free ride on that, and that there are questions, legitimate questions about state-funded enterprises buying businesses in Europe or elsewhere, or playing the public procurement market, that will need to be tackled, and perhaps we need to have slightly stronger trade, what used to be called trade defense instruments to deploy. That's not quite the same as direct subsidies. On your last point about risks of being too purist and having too much of a clean break, I do think there are risks in that, and that's why I'm very attached, I'll say it again, to the Europeans and the US and other like-minded countries having a proper dialogue about these issues and overcoming some of the things that, if we're not careful, may divide us. And that is around tax of this area, how you regulate this area, and it's been underlined by others, how you keep open the flow of data between all our companies across Europe and the US and other like-minded countries, so that we can work together to deliver the benefits that have been spoken about so convincingly by some of the speakers this morning.
Sir Julian King, what about continents, Asia, Africa, many of whom really don't want to make choices at this stage? How do you engage with them, even as they have substantive engagement with China and yet are a potential partner to both the Atlantic cousins?
Well, I agree. I think we do need to, unfortunately, more and more focus is being put upon this. we do need to be not only open to that kind of engagement, but active in reaching out and having that engagement, which is why those voices in the US, but not only in the US, that advocate a clean break are forcing people to make choices where perhaps it would be better to keep open options.
That's an important point. Martin, let me come back to you. You started this conversation. Yours will be the last substantive input before I ask you a binary question. All of you a binary question for the final round. But Martin, I want you to speak about supply chain diversity as you see it. But more importantly, I want you to answer another question. As countries become more inward-looking, and certainly United States is just one of them. There are many other countries that are beginning to enjoy a strong state, a strong sovereign. The Chinese offering of being able to control data, of being able to control their citizens, of being able to indulge in surveillance governance is very appealing. How do you counter this Chinese proposal to many countries who seem to be wanting solutions which China seems to have on the table?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Samir. Well, for one, just to go back to your initial point on diversity and supply chains, the path down toward protectionism, I don't think is the right answer because that just introduces a whole new slew of vulnerabilities that you just don't want. On your question on the growth of surveillance capitalism around the world. Again, this is where it's so important that liberal democratic countries make a clear position on what acceptable uses of technology are and are not. Right now, that's difficult for us to do because you still have Western companies that are selling surveillance technology to China, despite what we know is going on in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. So first of all, we have to stop selling those types of products to China and also putting export controls on the components that go into technologies that China could build themselves. And we have to use like the Global Magnitsky Act to place sanctions on individuals that are conducting this type of activity. That's the only way to send a clear message. The other side is, how do you counter the export of surveillance technology and the norms and values that China is selling to countries like Zimbabwe and Venezuela, for example? And this, I think, is where, again, cooperative efforts like new investment mechanisms where the world's liberal democracies can help emerging countries around the world afford technology that they still need. Surveillance technology obviously has legitimate uses for law enforcement, for example. But to be able to buy equipment that is secure, that they know the data won't be exfiltrated to Beijing to be used by the Chinese Communist Party. Those are the types of things Martin, we have to be talking about.
We are running out of time, but I think it's an important point on rethinking dual use in the technology age. And I think how we manage dual use technologies is going to be one of the important questions. I'm going to ask you all a simple binary question: decoupling or delusion? Pick one word that you think is going to define the next decade. Let me start with Martin and go down the panel. Martin, then Sir Julian King, then Ulf, and then Richard. Decoupling or delusion?
Decoupling, if done in a very responsible and strategic way.
Sir Julian King.
Well, let's avoid binary choices like your question.
Okay. Ulf.
I think that regional supply chains, if you call that decoupling, it's not a global supply chain, but regional supply chains make all the sense in the world, make great business sense, and that we are applying. So yes, some decoupling, but it's driven by business objectives.
Richard, final word.
Selective decoupling, 2 words.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for that very interesting discussion. I'm sorry it was slightly short because we had started late. Let me turn it back to the Master of Ceremonies, and thank you all for your remarks this morning.
Thank you, Samir.
Thank you very much, Samir. We have 3 voices for decoupling, and I hope you, ladies and gentlemen, have also made up your mind as to whether we are deluding ourselves or is the process of decoupling in all those technological supply chains possible.